Let's get some analysis from London. TRT World's Asha Tanna joins us live from Westminster. Asha?
Well, Ali John, the British public are waking up this morning very much a divided nation. Despite this bitterly and fiercely contested election rate, they have spoken. And the majority of people, 52%, voted to leave, with just 48% remaining. That small margin of just 1 million people tipped the UK vote into leaving the bloc of 28 nations. Now, we've had reaction this morning from the Bank of England, and their statement release said that the Bank of England will take all necessary steps to meet its responsibility for monetary and financial stability. How this is going to affect people here, let's bring in Miriam Francois. Miriam, what on earth does this mean for the UK public waking up on Friday?
Well, I think the word of the day really is a mood of uncertainty. People are waking up to a really new situation. This is the first time that a state has left the Union, so it's really uncharted territory. We know that Article 50 of the treaties stipulates 2 years within which a country can leave, but how and what that looks like is still completely unclear. We know that there's a lot of economic uncertainty. You talked about the Bank of England making certain promises to try and stabilise the markets. We've seen the pound slump to a low we haven't seen since 1985. Politically, we're also seeing a lot of uncertainty. David Cameron is due to speak quite soon. There's now questions over his leadership, not just of his party, but of the country. This is a man who led the country into a Remain vote. He was calling on the people to follow him in Remain, and they chose not to. What does that mean now for the country? Is he the right man to continue leadership? And even within his own party, there are calls for that to be put into question. The Labour Party itself is also now divided. It called on its voters to vote Remain. Many traditional Labour areas chose not to. What does that say about Labour leadership? Many are asking whether Corbyn's seeming ambivalence towards Europe might be to blame. And of course, what does this mean about disentanglement? I mean, the uncertainty here for the UK moving forward is there are so many layers to the UK's entanglement in Europe. Now it has to rebuild that. There will be new trade agreements that need to be built. All the laws that have been derived from Brussels now need to be rethought from the UK itself. And so we could be looking at a raft of new legislation. I think ultimately the fact is we don't know, and that uncertainty is being played out in the markets, and it's causing a lot of concern, I think, among the general population.
If we look at the Leave campaign themselves, one of the many things that they were pushing was accountability, not taking orders from Brussels, some 200 miles away, from European leaders setting rules and setting conditions for the people who want better jobs. What kind of, I mean, obviously there is uncertainty, but what sorts of industries are likely to be impacted, and can we see unemployment rising? And with regards to the recession, we've just come out of a recession. Back in 2008, the financial markets crashed. What's likely to happen next?
Well, we've already seen one of the major steel companies here in the UK saying that there could be a loss of over 180,000 jobs. I mean, there was some suggestion that might already be happening back in March, but that now looks set to go ahead. The markets, of course, people are questioning whether foreign investors now will continue to regard London as the right capital to invest in, if that's going to involve visas and tariffs, when they could now invest in a continental capital, which will be more secure for them, and certainly there'll be more certainty with regards to the previous situation. They don't need to battle with the uncertainty of what that new trade agreement will look like from the UK. So I think certainly a lot of industries reacting quite negatively to that, but ultimately the question is, will the new agreement be more beneficial to the UK? We know that over 1,000 FTSE 100 company leaders got together just before the election to really back a Remain vote, and they were doing that because they were arguing that there were dire consequences for the UK leaving the EU, certainly for businesses. And so really whether or not the new post-Brexit United Kingdom can negotiate agreements that will be more favourable than those that they were benefiting from within the EU is ultimately what will decide whether or not this was the right vote for the UK.
We are all still waiting for the Prime Minister David Cameron to make his address to the nation. Let's have a look at the role of the media. how the media has had an impact and what's been played out there. I want to bring in the issue of Rupert Murdoch. He's a media mogul. He owns two different newspapers, the tabloid Red Top, The Sun. Before the campaign, or during the campaign, before the voting, there was a huge headline, Be Leave. That was definitely backing a Brexit move. And then he also owns the Financial Times and the Times Group themselves, which was very much for a Remain campaign. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Mirror. What is the Mirror, the other tabloid newspaper, saying this morning on Friday?
Yeah, well, we have this, which was the front cover that would have appeared, would have been published last night, Project Reunite, which aims to encourage some sort of a healing process between the Remain and Leave supporters, but it actually carries an incorrect heading because it talks about Farage conceding defeat, which of course is what at the close of business yesterday, last night, many people, many analysts, the polls even were suggesting was the way we were looking. And of course the situation today is looking completely different. In fact, it's the exact reverse of what the polls were predicting last night. So yes, the media did get it wrong, the polls got it wrong, and now the new front pages, the new editorials are looking at why did the media get it wrong? Why did the polls get it wrong? And why is the UK so divided over this issue? I mean, you mentioned, of course, the Brussels red tape. A lot of frustration over the last few years and weeks we've heard over the idea that laws are being devised in Brussels, and that's completely disconnected from the UK voters and what they think. But there's also been immigration. We know that the issue of immigration was a big issue for the Leave camp, and this idea that net migration to the UK was up 330,000 in 2015. Over half of that was from within the EU. And of course, this was considered to be a blow to the Remain camp because it was seen as Cameron's promises that he could reduce immigration couldn't be upheld while the UK remained within the EU, that these promises could never be fulfilled. So of course, that's one of the issues that comes up. But also globalization, I think, is one of the issues that is being talked about a lot in some of the editorials I've been looking at this morning. And that's the idea that there are the winners and the losers. The large metropolitan cities that we've seen vote in favor of Remain tend to be full of people who've benefited from globalization, who see the EU as somewhere that actually is faulted. We know that there are still a lot of Eurosceptics amongst people who did vote Remain, but they still see the benefits outweighing the negatives. But there are those that feel left out by the process of globalization, and they see this as a way of reclaiming their position in the world. And so the whole argument over sovereignty is perhaps in many ways linked to concerns over globalization among voters who don't feel heard.
And of course, London and Westminster has a totally polarised opinion to what appears to be Wales and the provinces, almost an oasis surrounded by a surge towards leaving the EU.
Yes, and of course we know that London is in many ways a bit of an exception. It's a very cosmopolitan city and it doesn't reflect the rest of the United Kingdom. And ultimately the problem, of course, is that when you have the seat of power in London and a lot of the media coming out of London, they can be skewed, of course, by that perspective. What's important to recognise, of course, is that there are places that we thought were going to go for the Leave option, the Remain option, and opted for Leave. And that's where I think the questions over traditional Labour constituencies, Wales being a good example of this, why those areas have chosen to vote for Leave and ignore directives from Labour on this issue. And ultimately the question is this, I mean, if both parties were divided over this question, what is the new post-Brexit future going to look like? What is it going to actually offer? Because a lot of the uncertainty that people are concerned about is over the mapping of the post-Brexit future. That remains very unclear right now.
Okay, Miriam Francois, thank you very much. Well, we are expecting David Cameron to make an address to the nation within the next hour. The UKIP leader Nigel Farage has been out already celebrating his victory, saying that this was an Independence Day and that the people had voted, using similar terminology to the former London Mayor Boris Johnson. But we will bring you more analysis and, of course, reaction here from Westminster after David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, addresses the nation. Back to you, Ali John.
All right, Asha, you talked about with Miriam lots of uncertainty as the UK has decided to part ways with the European Union, with over 17 million people voting in the direction of that. Well, one thing is for certain, and that is Nigel Farage is a very happy man after last night.